When did New York streets get so hollow? New York City wants to revise its zoning code to restore the city's soul. Ms. Eckholm is a fellow at Cornell Tech's Jacobs Urban Tech Hub. In 2022, she served on the New York panel, created by the city and New York State to revitalize New York's central business districts after the COVID-19 pandemic. Over the past decade, there has been much hand-wringing about New York's puzzling empty storefront problem, with vacancy rates sitting north of 15% last fall in some of the city's most celebrated areas. How did streets, from the east to the West Village, once home to the urbanist Jane Jacobs, a champion of the city's neighborhoods, become so hollow? Rent escalation and the shift to e-commerce are, of course, obvious culprits. But behind the scenes, an important, largely overlooked factor is New York City's zoning code, enacted in 1961. Written in the face of fears of overcrowding, the code incorporated the postwar planning ideology that New Yorkers would live in tranquil residential neighborhoods and commute by car to office jobs in Midtown or to factory jobs on the city's periphery. The code also reflected an anachronistic, and at times elitist, view that limited where and how small businesses could operate. Businesses that might disrupt the peace were, in effect, banned in much of the city, to protect the nicer neighborhoods where wealthier New Yorkers were meant to reside. Today, over half a century later, the Department of City Planning is finally trying to overhaul the 1961 code and revive much of the mixed-use character and serendipitous storefront activity that gives New York its soul. The plan, known as City of Yes for Economic Opportunity, is part of a trio of initiatives from the Adams administration, aimed at bolstering business activity, building more housing and navigating the city toward carbon neutrality. The effort is a seemingly obvious step in New York's transformation into what the urbanists Edward L. Glazer and Carlo Ratti call the playground city, in which neighborhoods tie life, labor and leisure together. The plan includes proposals for 18 common-sense zoning amendments, informed by feedback from organizations and owners of small businesses, some of whom testified in its favor at a recent public hearing. Comments can be submitted to the City Planning Commission through February 15. But change is scary, and City of Yes for Economic Opportunity, which is set for a vote by the City Council this spring, has divided the city's 59 residential community boards. So far, 20 have voted in favor of the plan and 24 against. Opposition extends from Bay Ridge, to Whitestone, even to Jacobs's home turf, Greenwich Village. Some opponents fear that the revised zoning might bring more of the wrong kinds of businesses to their bucolic neighborhoods. Community board hearings have featured worries about escalatory, what-if, scenarios around activity that in many cases was, and still would be, illegal under the proposed changes. What if the new store on my corner starts selling under-the-counter marijuana and becomes a hangout for unsavory characters? What if a bar opens next to me and starts hosting Tuesday night dance parties, which break noise codes? The answer, proponents of the plan say, is better law enforcement rather than blanket prohibitions on where businesses can locate. The current zoning, they argue, penalizes the city's many hard-working and rule-abiding small business owners, who are the lifeblood of both New York street life and its economy. Much as freeways leveled neighborhoods, the 1961 code flattened streets into three primary types of zones: residential, commercial, and manufacturing. Zones were then broken down into numbered subsets, each of which was given a distinct set of permitted businesses. C5 commercial districts, for example, like Madison Avenue, were intended for the wealthy. That meant high fashion was permitted, but service businesses, like catering and appliance repair shops, were banned. By contrast, C6 commercial districts, like the area around Herald Square, were intended for the working class and permitted a broader range of uses, like billiards and wholesale retail. A whopping 426 uses of space are defined in the zoning, as varied as taxidermy specialists, typewriter repair shops and travel bureaus. All were assigned areas where they could operate. Existing businesses that did not conform with the new list of permitted uses in their locations were grandfathered in. But they were prohibited from making any substantial alterations to their footprint or evolving business operations, like repairing bicycles in a shop that was permitted only to do sales. And if a storefront was vacant for more than 2 years, the zoning would default to the new permitted uses, potentially precluding a new store from opening in an old one's place. In response to blight in the 1970s, the city eventually caved on the compliance question in some residential areas. But these restrictions persist in large sections of New York, applying to, for instance, beloved legacy businesses on and near Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, like Montero Bar, the Long Island Bar and Brooklyn Heights Deli, which are considered non-conforming. When the pandemic hit, it exposed all the ways in which our zoning is holding businesses back in their ability to respond to change. Matt Waskiewicz, an architect of City of Yes for Economic Opportunity at the city's planning department, told me, "To this day, in many parts of the city, from the Lower East Side to Bedford-Stuyvesant, there are empty storefronts that cannot be reoccupied under current code." City of Yes would do away with the 2-year vacancy clock altogether and focus on further integrating residential and commercial areas. That has prompted angst from some community board members, who seem to prefer to live in a homogeneous suburb. One of the most contentious amendments would create a process for approving new corner stores in residential neighborhoods, or what I jokingly call the Great Bodega Reform. Bodegas kept much of the city humming through the pandemic and are one of New York's defining cultural icons. Yet the amendment has found opposition in New York's outlying neighborhoods, where some residents apparently prefer to remain dependent on cars for their day-to-day purchases. City of Yes would also modernize permitted business types to reflect how contemporary New Yorkers spend their free time. In commercial zones, the plan would allow so-called maker spaces like microbreweries, 3D printing shops and pottery studios, which today are relegated to manufacturing areas. It would also permit amusement venues like escape rooms, arcades and other types of immersive entertainment, which the 1960s planners could have never dreamed of. Particularly fiery opposition surrounds an amendment to permit dancing and comedy in bars and restaurants that are already allowed live music. While some community groups have caricatured the plan as inviting cabarets to quiet neighborhoods, it is better seen as an attempt to recognize 21st-century social norms. New Yorkers like to dance, and they like to tell jokes. We should celebrate their creativity, not silence them through arcane zoning laws. In 1961, planners tried to force residents into lifestyles and patterns they thought appropriate for their station and that era. Rather than a city that lives in fear of what-ifs, New York should be a city of possibility that evolves with the times. It's 2024. Let's not let mid-century thinking kill our vibe.